This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on aircraft manufacturing facility in India, a giant leap towards self-reliance in defense and aviation sector. The participants are retired Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur and Dinkar Perry, journalist.
Yesterday on October 30, Prime Minister Narendra Modi laid the foundation stone for C-295 transport aircraft manufacturing facility at Vadodara in Gujarat, which will be set up by a consortium of Airbus Defence and Space and Tata Advanced Systems Limited in India. The contract for C-295 is for 56 aircraft, of which 16 will be coming in flyaway condition from Spain from next year onward. And the remaining 40 aircraft will be manufactured at the facility in India. So this is the first time a private sector company will be manufacturing a full aircraft in this country. And the project also has a lot of significance for the Indian Air Force, which has been trying to replace the Avro for some time. So to begin with, I'm aware that you have been personally involved in the replacement project, which began over a decade back. So can you give the significance of this project for the Indian Air Force, this Avro replacement in the C-295?
We had, and we still have, a large number of Avro transport aircraft, medium lift, which were used initially for passenger carrying and cargo. But now we have very few left, which are in flying condition and being used basically for communication of passengers, that is the Air Force passengers, and certain case VIPs. So these Avros came in almost 4 decades plus and needed a replacement. So we had started in 2009-10. The proposal we floated within Air Headquarters for the Avro replacement. And at that point of time, we hit upon, the Operations Directorate in Air Headquarters, Transport and Helicopters, of which I was heading as the Assistant Chief. We drafted the operational requirements, which were then consolidated into the request for proposals, etc., and sent up to the ministry to proceed with the government clearance, which is called the acceptance of necessity, and then the subsequent action. We hit upon, or Air Headquarters hit upon, a very novel idea of trying to get a second line of manufacturing in the country. The only line which we had, or the only agency which we had was, and we still have only, is Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. And it was felt that their order book was so full that they were not able to meet the timelines, besides many other factors. One was the huge contracts, huge numbers that were piling up for them. And it would always be good to get some sort of a competition going. So we hit upon an idea about like the Avro proposal, Avro replacement project. Actually forwarded a very unique way of going in to get whichever aircraft was selected. So finally it was the C-295, and the Indian agencies were evaluated who all could manufacture that, who had the capability to manufacture that in terms of technical expertise as well as monetary power. And as we now know, it is the Tatas who have got the contract.
So on that note, just one additional question with respect to the Air Force before we go on to the larger industry issue. There was a project for a joint development project of this, of a medium transport aircraft with Russia, which fell apart. So now for the future, now that we don't have another development program in the work at this point of time, and we also have the AN-32s to replace, which is the workhorse. We have 100 of them flying. Is there a potential for C-295 now that we have the plant, coming up and the deliveries will start next year, given the size and it's a modern aircraft? Does it have the potential to become a future replacement for the AN-32?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the operational requirements that they put in is that the aircraft, whichever is selected, should have ramp loading system. That means the rear of the aircraft opens up as a ramp. So it is very easy to load items inside and take them out. Plus, depending on the size of the fuselage, depending on the size of the body, a small vehicle like a jeep or something can also be put in. The AN-32 has the ramp, but the Avro does not. So the first replacements are the Avros, which are the older aircraft. And as and when, maybe 5-6 years down the line, when AN-32s have to be replaced, it would only be a wise decision that we replace them with the C-295. Now the C-295 is in the 7 to 10 ton class capacity. The AN-32 carries 3 to 4 tons. So vis-a-vis the load, it is much better placed. It has got much better set of avionics, more modern and fuel-efficient engines, and a rear ramp for loading. So it meets all the criteria. So I personally feel, and that was certainly there at the back of our mind, that once the Avros get replaced, it would be good if the same aircraft, whichever is selected for its replacement, moves into the position of AN-32s when they phase out. That would be a right step to take.
Indeed, sir, it also brings commonality of platforms, ease of operations as well. On that, sir, moving forward to the next part of the larger significance of the project, Indian companies have been manufacturing components, spares, and systems, subsystems even over the last 2 decades, including Tata and many others, for the global OEMs and aerospace companies supplying to their global supply chains. But this is the first time an entire aircraft will be built here. So it represents a significant milestone. So can you encapsulate that, of what it means for the larger industry?
Oh, it's a very good step that we have got, as I said earlier, a second line of manufacturing away from Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. So our deliveries will be faster. Plus, we have an alternative. Competition is also brought into focus. The larger aspect is that whenever an aircraft is built up or a new manufacturing environment is developed in a way, an ecosystem develops around it. We have basically a Western aircraft now comes, which will be manufactured in Vadodara. And around that would come up the ancillary industries for local units, for spares, for ancillaries. And that is so good, not only from the point of view of employment for skilled and non-skilled labor, but also for our engineers. And then we can work. This becomes a stepping stone for the development of aircraft which are designed and produced de novo in India. That's very important, that we don't make the mistake that we have made in the last 5-6 decades, that we have been doing licensed manufacturing and not building on. So and it is hoped that with the private sector in, which is a little more energetic and forward-looking than any public sector, and it's just not in India, it's everywhere in the world. So with the private sector entity coming in, it is hoped that they do R&D and build on the C295 for future transport aircraft. Because very soon, I think at some point of time, we would be requiring a heavier set of aircraft which can carry a greater payload. And we must do that. And we should look at the Embraer model of Brazil, which moved from a small utility aircraft to passenger carrying aircraft. And now they are well into the heavies with rear loading.
So you touched upon a very critical issue in the whole, digitization effort. What you said, the license manufacturing, which we have failed to kind of graduate in the last few decades. The whole emphasis on the Atmanirbhar Bharat, the Make in India initiative. What are the enablers required to kind of move to the next level in terms of being a real manufacturer, from being a licensed assembler?
Basically, I think 4 things. First is the cost of capital. In India, the cost of capital is very high. So many of the startups, many of the entrepreneurs fall by the wayside because they require money to set up initial large sums, because aviation is very capital intensive, any aviation activity. So the cost of capital needs to come down, and hence loans have to be at lower subsidized rates. That's number one. Number two, entities would require land or areas where manufacturing facilities can come up. That's number two. Third, parallelly, the government has to look into our educational setup, because you require engineers, you require skilled labor, skilled personnel. So parallel courses to be started in possibly ITIs, because it's a normal welding job in an aviation manufacturing. It's not a simple welding as is done on the street side. It's very, very specialized work, and you require skilled personnel for that. So you require skilled personnel coming up. And fourth, we require engineers, aeronautical engineers. So young students who are moving into engineering colleges must see a future for themselves if they want to opt for aerospace engineering or aerospace sciences. And that is something that needs to be developed so that the youngsters who are coming into the higher education bracket see a future for themselves. Otherwise, people will not opt for such sciences and go somewhere else. So I think these are 4 things which are required to graduate to the next step.
Now, just looking at the platform itself, it's a military platform. But while the domestic aviation industry in India is probably in a nascent stage in terms of manufacturing capabilities, on the civilian side, it's in a much better shape, given that over the years, aircraft manufacturers have been sourcing and, developing capacities and competence in the country. For example, Airbus and Boeing both. So in that sense, what do you see? Because now that we have a manufacturing line here, C295 also fits the bill for a civilian transport given the UDAN scheme, and which has been again referred to by the Prime Minister as well in his comments. So how do you see that potential, and what is the effort required to kind of realize that? As I said again, not waste the opportunity.
When you're talking of civil aviation, it's all dependent on the financial bottom line. So it's important that you have an environment where people are going to take aircraft to go to smaller places. So that has to be developed with a lot of research, which is not only technical but business oriented. Now, in our country, so many efforts had started. Earlier we had the Vayudu, and there were so many airlines that started but fell by the wayside. And that somehow has not taken off. So I personally feel that a little more detailed study is required to get the regional services going. That would only happen if the tickets become cheaper. So whether there is subsidy given or whatever, that is something which the government has to decide. Would C295 fit the bill for a feeder airliner? I personally feel that it is slightly on the bigger side. When you're talking of feeder services to district areas, district headquarters, I think you require a smaller aircraft than C295, like the Dornier 228, for example, that class of an aircraft. C295, I think, would be a little bigger for this. Would C295 be taken by airlines, like the ATRs, which are functioning now? That is something that the airlines could look into, because the servicing and the repairs would be available within the country, and that would be beneficial for them.
One prescription for the Air Force itself. The transport fleet of the Air Force is kind of in a flux at the moment, if I would say. We know the case of the fighters as well as Hepters, it's a different thing. Transport is in a better situation, but we are also looking at, a phasing out phase. Beginning with the Avros and the AMs. So it's a huge, huge void. C295 is one, but then in a broader sense, now again, as we discussed earlier, the MTA, the Medium Transport Aircraft project has failed to take off. There's no other option at the moment on the drawing board. So what is the best mixture of it going forward? Should we take up another project, or, what is the way forward for the Air Force itself to stagger its transport fleet?
The heavy lift would be given by the C-17, which have just come in roughly 6, 7, 8 years back. And they are in the 70 ton, 65 to 70 ton payload. Next, we have the IL-76s, which is around 36 to 40 ton carriage capacity. That is where we have to look into, because the ILs also would be finishing their life sometime down the line, maybe a decade from now. The third one is the 20 ton class, which somewhere the C-130s, that sort of a thing. But the C-130s that we have gone are for special operations. And then comes the AN-30. So, as we discussed in the beginning of this program, the AN-32 being replaced by the C-295 would be a very logical step. And the C-295 has got greater payload, it's more modern, more fuel efficient. So it will be an ideal replacement for the AN-32s as and when they start phasing out. So we would be getting into the 8 to 9 ton class of the C-295, the C-130s around 20 tons, and the IL-76 is something that we would have to look into if required. In the meanwhile, if we are talking of 2 decades and the private sector is up to the mark and willing to put in money, and the government assists the private sector, then we should be hopefully graduating to a class of aircraft higher than the C-295 with R&D and being manufactured in it. If I may just add, we don't have to make everything within the country. When we are talking of Atmanirbharta, it does not mean that 100% of the aircraft has to be made within the country. It's just not possible. It's not possible anywhere in the world. Even the Americans, they are integrators. Boeing is an integrator of it. So similarly, we have to see how best to integrate. Like Embraer in Brazil is basically an integrator. The Comscotton Embraers which are flying, their engines are British. They are serviced in Portugal. So the avionics are American. So it's a mix, but integration capability is something that we have to get within the country.
It's been a very interesting discussion, and as in the end, you kind of gave the crux. We don't have to build everything. We have to build the critical ones. We have to be the integrator, prioritize something, and we need an enabling framework and the private sector to come in and invest. And for that, they should see that their return. So on that note, we come to the end of this edition of Spotlight. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dinakar. Thank you very much. And the fact that C295 is going to be made in India is very good news.
You were listening to a discussion on aircraft manufacturing facility in India, a giant leap towards self-reliance in defense and aviation sector. The participants were retired Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur and Dinkar Perry, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.